what has been revealed is that ultimately you only achieve meaningful political changes and cultural changes when you bypass the levers of government.
Welcome back to The Tea. I'm your host, Myriam Francois. Chuck D once famously called hip-hop the CNN of the streets, the voice of the voiceless. But today, when it's any good, that voice isn't just reporting the news. It's filling a vacuum left by a dying political order. When a staggering 83% of young people don't believe that democracy is working for them, you aren't looking at a lack of interest in politics. You're looking at a total collapse of belief in the systems of governance. In the US, a mere 7% of young people think the current system even has the tools to fix itself. This is the Great Exodus, a generation that has lost faith in the ballot box to address their aspirations. So they've taken to the streets. From the 20 million strong surge of Black Lives Matter to the campus occupations for Palestine and the climate justice movement, youth-led direct action is at fever pitch. But it isn't just young people either. Older generations are increasingly joining in too. At one major London demonstration in support of Palestine Action, the average age of those arrested was 54, with more than 100 over 70. But everyone is hitting a wall of institutional silence, and worse still in many cases, repression. So where does that fire go when the state tries to extinguish it? Historically, it goes into the culture, but even that space is under attack. After last year's BBC censorship of Glastonbury after that Bob Dylan chant, the police investigation of Irish rap duo Kneecap over alleged proscribed flags, and this year the government has literally banned one of London's biggest music festivals, Wireless, after it planned to headline Kanye. From the spirituals that steeled the civil rights movement to the anthems that brought down apartheid, music has always been the connective tissue of activism. And if we're talking about the voice of that resistance today, we're talking about one man. He's West London's pride, but his reach is unapologetically global. He's a poet intellectual who spent 2 decades dismantling the narratives of empire, brick by lyrical brick. While the industry was chasing the charts, he was charting the soundtrack to the struggle. From his legendary Fire in the Booth sessions, still the gold standard for lyrical consciousness, to tracks like Long Live Palestine that have bypassed the gatekeepers to reach tens of millions. He's become a target precisely because he is effective. He is a living icon and quite simply one of the most vital voices of our generation. Lowkey, welcome to the show.
Wow, what an incredible introduction.
Mashallah, you deserve every word of it.
But
let's get into why, because there's good reason behind it. I've watched you interviewed so many times, and one of the things I've always remained curious about is the personal story. You know, what was the kind of mood music that created Lowkey?
So I would say I was quite fortunate in that there was an extent of political involvement on the side of my parents. I was exposed to things like Frantz Fanon earlier than some of my peers. I was exposed to things around the house from Cuba, for example. I also think that when you understand the trajectory of people's lives, you see them as subject to the political movements in and around them. So there's both the macro and there is the micro. I would also say that we benefit, though, from the struggles which took place before it. And so in my case, the exposure to music as a form of activism was also something that came from my background, insofar as understanding that where the political system does not provide the opportunity to voice particular ideas or to collectivize a certain energy, music will provide that opportunity.
Any names you could drop?
So, I mean, obviously, of course, Public Enemy, I had exposure to them. I had exposure to Gil Scott-Heron. Also, Bob Marley, in some ways also. But then also there was on the Iraqi side of things, which, you know, my ability to understand cultural production in Arabic increased with age, and that was a deliberate decision But, you have the example of poets like Aziz Ali, who was active through several different epochs of Iraqi government, from the monarchy through the Abdul Karim Qasim period, and then later on. And through almost all of those periods, he was finding ways to problematize what was being accepted on a wide level. And also then the use of technology. So, for example, he had the song, the radio. And this was during the time of the British Mandate of Mesopotamia, and later on the monarchy. He's pointing out the use of the radio as a form of resistance to colonialism. He says, "Ma dam yaftah al-istimar," as long as it exposes colonialism. And when you read Frantz Fanon, and you look at the way the radio was used in the Algerian struggle against French colonialism, I think that question of where technology meets culture and then meets political power kind of cuts to what we're talking about here, because that imbalance in terms of technological power has increased massively over those years. When you're talking about the Algerian struggle, they were not subject, no civilization historically has been subject to the same level of all-encompassing surveillance that we are today.
Absolutely.
And that really can be seen in the war and the genocide in Gaza and the war in Lebanon. That, I would say, disparity in technological power. So within all of that, I was fortunate to receive some form of a political education by the involvement of those close to me and around me in the political struggles of their day. But then I was also politicized through the events which took place around me. If you think 2003, that period of time, I was a teenager, you're starting to see the state around you adopt what you understand to be an antagonistic posture.
So you're talking about the post 9/11 era.
Absolutely,
You're
yeah.
talking about the kind of so-called war on terror, the criminalization of, Muslim and Arab identities. So that was a kind of mood music upon which sort of your own identity as a young man was being shaped. You start writing lyrics at 12, and then you write several albums. By 2011, you've released your second album, right? Soundtrack to the Struggle. Mm-hmm. But then in 2012, just as your career was kind of peaking in many ways, you decided to take a hiatus from music. Can you tell us why it was that you decided to step back from music at that time?
It is a fact that when music and politics rub so closely against each other, there can be an extent to which repression becomes a part of the picture. And I was involved in protest movements, and I did face some forms of legal pressure at that time, though it wasn't the specific cause of me stepping away from being a sort of publicly active person. I think it's important that people also know that during that period that I wasn't making music publicly, I got a qualification to teach English. I got a qualification as a personal trainer. I got a qualification, master's degree. I also
in Middle Eastern Studies from SOAS.
Yeah. And I spent, fortunately, almost a year in Palestine, in Nablus. And I also worked as part of something called London to Calais, where we were going to the camps in Calais. We were going into the camps and obtaining the cases and taking down as much personal details about the individuals as possible that we could then give to law firms that were working pro bono to get people into the country. And we succeeded in that process at that time. So all of that together is to say, I felt at that time that making music was not the best use of my brain and my mind, and being active publicly wasn't the best way to strengthen myself in the way I thought was necessary. And so I was able to do that for a few years. And then I was looking at this situation where people were telling me about their experiences and the way that they were suffering in Calais. And I thought, what is the best way for me to reach the largest amount of people in order to try and impress on this society, the humanity of these people that are suffering in this way. And this is very much the human cost of, what you're talking about, the big macro thing of the war on terror. It was a big structure. And then off the back of it, there was all different forms of human suffering. And one of the ones that was most apparent to me was those who were attempting to, brave that passage. And this is a simple fact that I think often gets forgotten in a lot of the propaganda, that across the last 3 to 4 decades, there have been around 30,000 people that have died trying to enter Fortress Europe.
Mediterranean's a graveyard.
Absolutely. They've sunk in small boats there. They've fallen from planes. They've frozen to death in the back of trains. And there's a myriad of ways in which the movement of people has been made exponentially harder over these years. And so I felt that music was the best possible way for me to kind of strike back against a lot of that propaganda. And so then that compelled me to make a song on the issue.
On that point, so you've previously said the greatest tool to participate in that process of widening democratic participation, of redistributing political power and economic power, is music. What is it about, a 3-minute song that can reach people today that you believe is more effective than, say, an article? Because let's be honest, after you went and did your master's at SOAS, you could have gone into journalism, you could have gone into think tanks, you could have gone into political advisory, you could have gone into politics, right? I mean, you could have...
Not with my history, but yeah.
There's any number of different routes of how, that skill set could have been put to use, but you decided music was the most effective. So what is it about music that makes it so effective?
I would probably take issue with what I said there, because I wouldn't say it's the greatest tool. I think the point is that music can interact with the material realities in an interesting way, but it's very difficult to quantify, and it's very difficult to actually trace the effect of that, for example. But I think with music, what it does is it gives people mantras which they can repeat and can crystallize an understanding of the reality. It also, I would say, stimulates emotion in a way that it's rare that writing can do. One of the great things about Ta-Nehisi Coates is the way that he stimulates emotion with his writing. But I think especially when you're going through the university process, in my case anyway, you're having to build arguments based on empirical data, which I think also has a place, because in terms of the power of conviction, I think data, and articles will give you that intellectual grounding. But in terms of stirring people to action, I think music can touch emotions in a way that is really very unique.
Your music has been the soundtrack to the resistance, and we hear it, at any number of protests that you go to for Palestine and beyond today. You will hear a Lowkey track. That is a fact. And that's in different countries. I've been in France and heard your tracks as well.
Wow.
So, you've topped hip hop charts, you've had millions of streams, the Fire in the Booth that you did with Charlie Sloth has got, I think, just over 6.6 million views. There are comments on it from this week. Right. People are still commenting on that video today. Why don't we hear you on the radio?
Well, if you look historically prior to the internet, the radio really had a monopoly on what did and didn't exist. And so with the case of Tim Westwood, for example, he was seen at the time as a gatekeeper, really,
Absolutely.
For what did and didn't exist.
Should we just, for people who may not be from that gen, explain who Tim Westwood was? Because obviously now he probably is best known for being accused of misusing his position of power with regards to a number of women. But he was considered one of the biggest hip-hop DJs?
He was one of the biggest hip hop DJs. Was familiar with his show from Capital FM. I personally preferred DJ 279 and Friday Night Flavors on Choice FM. That was also another part of my kind of love for music as a form of articulation, listening to Choice FM at night, and then the radio would still be on in the morning, and then I might listen to Radio 5 Live, even though I didn't really understand it, but things were seeping through, particular politicians. I remember knowing who Jacques Chirac was, for instance, at a time when others, were kind of surprised that I would know that. And that was just through the radio. So it's in that way that technology was already kind of educating me. But Tim Westwood was somebody who I would say would focus on a limited dimensional perspective on what rap was and what the art was.
And when you say limited?
Well, I mean, he was never somebody that would... And, there's also a story to be told about how the era in which you had lyricist lounge and conscious hip-hop artists, what were called conscious hip-hop artists, from Mos Def to Talib Kweli, Raucous Records, a key investor to that was Rupert Murdoch's son. And so Rupert Murdoch's son, James Murdoch, he pulled the funding for Raucous Records after it only existing for a few years. And so in a way, it aborted the development of conscious hip-hop as a major cultural force, I would say, during that time, because Lyricist Lounge was very popular. Dead Prez was very popular. I later was fortunate to travel to Gaza with M1 from Dead Prez. Mos Def was popular. Talib Kweli was popular. They still are. These are really legendary figures, and I've been fortunate to meet them all. But their music was stunted, I would say, by that force within the music industry. And so with Tim Westwood, in a way, I would say what he provided was a caricature of what this form of expression was. And then it became a self-fulfilling prophecy of you produce the caricature becomes bigger, and then you're able to tell people, this is what's hot, this is what people like.
And then the thong song becomes the anthem of every club night.
But then, I think the interesting part of where my story, to some extent, intersects with Tim Westwood was that I'm booked to appear on his show in 2011, September 11th.
Your second album's just come out?
Well, the second album comes out in October.
So it's just before the release.
Just about to come out. So there's, at that time, there's quite a buzz. And I'm contacted to come on his show. I agree. I'm then called on the day and told, we can't have you on, sorry, bye. Seems strange to me. Someone within the BBC then contacts me and says, they cancelled it because it was September 11th and they were concerned that you would say something on air. Now, I leave that where it is. The album comes out, it does what it does.
Which, you're being modest, tops the hip-hop charts, does very well, becomes very popular, whether or not it makes the radio or not is a much talked about album. And then there's a disconnect, right, between the popularity of the album, the popularity of you as an artist, and the reflection of that for many of us on the screens and the sound waves that we're listening to. In
the midweek overall album charts, and it was only released digitally, so it gets to 33 in the overall midweek album charts. And then it ends up at 57 at the end. Now, at that time, that was an anomaly, because it wasn't common. We'd had Tinchy Stryder, for example, who in 2009, it's worth remembering, was the largest selling UK artist at all. Dizzy Rascal had obviously smashed the charts, but it was rare generally for people from our scene to step into that place. And so it was quite a breakthrough in some ways. And then in early 2012, asked to appear on Tim Westwood Crib Sessions. And I say, and it's worth remembering that he had, before that, travelled with BBC One Extra at the behest of the Ministry of Defence and transmitted his show, broadcasted his daily show for BBC One Extra from Camp Bastion in Afghanistan. And, you know, the pictures that came out of it showed written on a board, drop a bomb, Westwood. So it's this interesting kind of meeting of him constantly dropping bombs on air, which it has actual connotations. It does normalize this idea of bombing places. It's sort of like a kind of crude manifestation in some ways of this, I would say, valorization of the military-industrial complex. That's what I would say it represents to me anyway. And I understand it wouldn't represent that to everyone. But anyway, so he goes to Afghanistan and it's basically an advert for joining the army. You know, they're going through recruitment. Literally 15,000 people are leaving the British Army every year. They are in a situation where they need fodder, human material. And so Westwood came in and used his show and then used the genre of hip hop to basically promote that idea to young people, particularly ethnic minorities, because One Extra was, the home of black music. That was the way it was put out there. So when they asked me to go in his show, I said, okay, I'm going to publicly refuse for the following reason, X, Y, Z, and then I published an article about that. So I think that I always instinctively took quite an antagonistic posture towards mainstream things, and rightly or wrongly. So that would then inform the trajectory of what you were going to do after, say, getting a master's. It was never an option for me to go towards a think tank or go towards the mainstream, because I always viewed it as ultimately against me.
You probably have heard of the photographer and South Bank chair, Mizan Harriman. He recently said, you can either be an artist or an entertainer. And that being an artist means kind of reflecting the times that we're living through. What do you think the role of the artist is today? And what is the purpose, or should I ask, function of entertainment when the world is burning?
If you look at the companies, and particularly now after the Larry Ellison takeover of many of these companies, if you look at where the personal political orientations of the people in the upper echelon of the companies that control entertainment, it normally goes along a certain line. There may be some that are Democrats. There's many that are Republicans, probably more actually that are Democrats, I would say. But ultimately, they are often very pro-Israel. And that can actually be traced quite clearly by looking at the political donations made by these individuals, by looking at the organizations they're involved with, by looking at the political pronouncements that they make. And so therefore, it's not an apolitical space.
Music is not apolitical.
Of course not. It's impossible. It's impossible for that to be the case. What then I think should be the role of artists in that would be, Mahmoud Darwish said, لما تحرر نفسك باستعارات فكر بغيرك من فقدوا حقهم في الكلام. When you liberate yourself with metaphors, think of others who lost their right to speak. And I think that keeping that in mind is always important. Whereas often in the case of the entertainment industry, it's quite the opposite. They, rather than aiming to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, they aim to comfort the comfortable and afflict the afflicted more. And in particular political moments, they are overpaid and underuseful. And in my personal opinion, I am no longer comfortable with the idea that wearing a pin on the red carpet of an award ceremony actually qualifies as a respectable form of political involvement. We have prominent figures, some writers, who have actively funded direct action against Israeli arms companies. That, to me, is a respectable form of political involvement at this time. We should expect more and we should ask more, you know?
Well, on that note, Stormzy, who incidentally has your handle in his bio, faced some backlash, if you recall, last year after partnering with McDonald's, which is obviously one of the big brands on the BDS list. The criticism then intensified because he'd previously obviously posted in support of Palestine, and then the post got taken down, although he claims that that's something that he does quite regularly. He archives his posts. And that, according to him, brands can't tell him what to do. Stormzy's an artist who's obviously been vocal on many issues. Obviously, Grenfell was one of them. Was the backlash warranted?
Stormzy went on the Brit Awards after Grenfell and said to the Prime Minister of this country, in the context of Grenfell, we should burn your house down and see if you can manage it. Now, that is a significant risk that a person has taken out of love for other people. I know of many things that he has done for many people that have never been publicized and probably never will be publicized, which are rooted in a belief in fighting the powers that be, and that a person would never make those kind of decisions were they not motivated deeply by a love for others and a recognition of their suffering. Now, when things become wrapped up in corporate deals, there are many decisions that people with a certain level of weight in terms of celebrity-wise make, which I think often they may not have been given full access to the information surrounding that corporation at the time.
Are we under the impression that he was not aware that McDonald's was on the BDS list? Because there's about 3 million people in the comments.
I don't understand the post to have been deleted for a political reason. That's not my understanding. In terms of the point at which contracts are made, these artists that exist in that particular space will be inundated with corporate deals all the time. And so corporations will always want to involve them in advertising in some way.
Meaning they have choices.
Meaning they have choices, but meaning that it's my personal belief that he wouldn't have known the extent of involvement with the Israeli military. It's not a question ultimately for me to answer because I don't know that, but I think it's unlikely that somebody with his track record who, as far as I understand, put my name there out of support for Gaza at the time. That's my understanding.
It's still there.
And it's still there. And that's been there for 3 years. So when you understand people's motivations, I think you gain a bit more of an insight into what's happening there. And so my understanding is that the motivations to do that and to do many other things which people don't know about and people will never know about. And he's not the only one, by the way, you know. Dave.
Of course, I was going to talk to you about Dave. I was going to talk to you about these examples of artists who many people will have come up listening to for the specific reason that they love their politics, right? These are people whose come up was based on the fact that people were just like, yes, somebody is saying the quiet bit out loud and they're saying it on a public stage and they're doing it in a way that resonates. And then once
in a
they
brave
get...
way too.
Absolutely. And hats off.
And in an involved way. I think that's the other thing that people may not completely be aware of, is that there's points when individuals have become involved in things they didn't have to become involved in at a point where there's significant risk to them and helped a lot of people. And so in Dave's case, for example, and I don't know if people know this, he donated hundreds of thousands of pounds to Gaza, you know, and it was something that me and him spoke about, and he contacted me before it, and I connected him in some way. But, you know, this is a beautiful thing for people to do. But there's many other ways, unfortunately. There's many other ways in which, if we look at a company like Google, if we look at a company like Amazon, There are many people who are pro-Palestinian in pronouncements and otherwise that work with companies like that. And there's differing extents to which those companies are engaged with what Israel does. Do I think that it discredits the art? No. Do I think that as an individual they may have made what I believe to be an incorrect decision? Yes. Would I say that if they had full access to information, they would probably make a decision which would more align with something that I say? I would say probably, yeah, from what I know.
How do you explain this process, though, that some of these artists, some of whom we've just discussed just now, they come up on this hyper-political messaging, and then, I mean, Dave's even said it publicly, taking a bit of a step back and sort of saying, I'm sort of, I don't feel the need to be as political, or I'm not going to be as political. And what happens for that to occur? Because without placing individual blame, and I really mean this because, I was also going to put to you the idea that for some people, particularly coming from certain communities, just succeeding against the odds might be considered the win. And I know people who would say that to me, who say you're asking too much of people who fought too hard to just be in the space. I'd love to kind of even get your view on that. But let's talk about, therefore, like the pressures. I mean, what are the pressures that artists, you've come under it yourself, your music, there were attempts to ban your music from Spotify. Give us a sense, because people don't know what happens in the industry. What are these pressures?
An interesting aspect of that is that when the Israel lobby attempted to remove my music, the support that came from within the industry, from many by the artists, so people that were even in high positions at some of the labels, they all signed the letter, the open letter to Spotify, and in some cases, these are people that, whether it's them or their record labels, are worth millions to Spotify. So it tipped the balance in a position where, as a company, if Spotify now has the chance of losing millions in revenue by removing my music, and then these artists saying, okay, in protest, we're going to remove it, they won't do it. And so it's interesting the way in which structures bind people into social arrangements that they actually disagree with. When we're talking about the three largest music companies in the world, okay? Talking about Universal, talking about Warner, you're talking about Sony. If you look at the very top of Universal, okay, which some of the artists that you've mentioned are and have been in long-term deals with those companies, are they expected to go through the Charity Commission documents and look at the details of the wife of the CEO of Universal's charitable donations before they sign their deal? That's for crazy people like me. And so that's something that when you look at, you say, okay, so the CEO of Universal Music, UMG, the largest company in the world, Lucian Grange, close friend of David Cameron, close friend of Rishi Sunak, has attended Friends of the IDF fundraisers. His wife has a family foundation, has a role in distributing from a family foundation, which has funded key Israel lobby groups. So there is a political orientation which is traceable there. Now, would that necessarily mean that a person, and I would take issue slightly with the idea that they sort of came up off of political music. I don't believe they did. I think they came up off of viral YouTube buzz around lyrical talent. But then what was also present was a political analysis, which was informed by their own experiences and their families' experiences and what was happening around them. I think the same as any people that will be exposed to a lot fast, things change around them very quickly, and almost everything around them will be trying to push them away from doing the Brit Awards 2017 or 18. That's seen as never let that happen again. There'll be people it's almost their job within a company that will be to discourage someone from doing that type of thing, to limit risk in that way. And there's a lot of money riding on it. So I've never been in that position. It's never been available to me because of the decisions that I made and the way I positioned myself.
But you've spoken about it before. I mean, you posted on X that while serving as director at Universal Music Group, Haim Saban was lobbying the White House over arms sales to Israel during the genocide, the ongoing genocide in Gaza. His name has also appeared on a leaked list of people Netanyahu reportedly saw as personal funders. You also highlighted that. Universal distributes the music of virtually every major artist in the world. So what does that say about the independence of culture when someone on the board of the world's biggest music company is publicly using their influence in this way? And I say this only because of the to come back to where we started this conversation. The mood music you grew up with, we both grew up with in many ways, that kind of fostered a sort of intellectual, I would argue, rebelliousness, renaissance, a consciousness. How do you foster that today, given the state of what you've researched and highlighted? If you're enjoying the show, why not join our Patreon community? The Tea is more than just a YouTube show. It's a space to foster meaningful change together at a time of violent turbulence and dizzying change. Becoming a Patreon means you get exclusive content and the chance to shape the show. So join us now, link in our bio.
Well, I think the internet changed things. So I think what we were kind of alluding to at the beginning is that when the radio basically was the window to the world, and then MTV was the window to the world, these things were gatekeeping what could and couldn't ultimately exist. And that all of that was working in tandem with the labels. And so that monopoly was broken. But really it was broken first by things like LimeWire, like Napster, and if you look at the pronouncements of someone like Leo Cohen, he describes it as this Greek tragedy of this massive act of theft, right? So it's interesting because they then look at YouTube as an extension, and this is prior to him becoming the head of music at YouTube. They look at it as an extension of the theft represented by Napster. So then they have to find a way to control YouTube and turn it back into something which empowers the music industry, at which point he, becomes the head of music, and then it becomes a key source of revenue for those labels. So they were able to fight back power. And that's the truth of the story. But when you look at the development of whether it's Graham Daly, SBTV, someone like Stormzy, someone like Dave, it was first viral on the internet where there was, I would say, a greater democratic environment, really, for people to naturally, to some extent, because at that time, the algorithms were less ideologically slanted. Now, I think all of that has become a little bit tougher.
And just for our Gen Zers watching this who have no idea what Napster is, it was, I guess, a platform where you could download MP3s. Let me ask you now a little bit about the moment in which we find ourselves in, because we're obviously talking as the Israel-US war against Iran is raging. We're also speaking at a time where, we've crossed paths over the last 2.5 years at many Palestine-related events. And I would love to get your gauge on where we stand today, because it feels to me like, it's been such a roller coaster. There's been the sort of campus occupations were a moment of real sort of strength, of political strength in the movement. Now where we find ourselves is, there's this, the war on Gaza, the war on Palestine has now gone global. And it's unclear to me with what we've seen in terms of like the pushback in the media space, the growth in surveillance we've briefly touched on. Are the people winning, Kareem?
At the time of the Nakba in 1948, the Palestinian population globally was between 2 and 3 million people. Okay, so Israel was able to displace almost 1 million Palestinians at that time. Palestine was supposed to end at that point. In the case of the Naksa, when they took over Gaza and the West Bank, it was also supposed to be the final death knell of the Palestinian people. Today, you have close to 15 million Palestinians in the world. So while Zionism was able to establish an ethnocracy, which is now what they call, I learned this word recently, ponerology, which is a rule by sociopaths and psychopaths. And it's also a kakistocracy. It's also a kakistocracy at the same time, in which it is ruled by the worst. What will ultimately, and what has ultimately been a key part of the defeat of the Zionist project, is demography. Because the Zionist project was about engineering a situation where you could have a ruling Jewish majority within a place where the majority of people historically were not Jewish. It was even within that about making sure that Ashkenazis were privileged above what they call Mizrahim.
Who are native in many cases to the region.
You could put it that way, but in the case of Israel, they're mainly Iraqis, Moroccans, and Yemeni origin. And all of them have different stories of how, if you look at the Iraqi case, you had the denaturalization law, which was signed in 1951, implemented basically under the pressure of the Zionists by someone who had been, Tawfiq al-Suwaidi, who had been cultivated by the Zionists since the 30s. And if you look at the writing of the Zionist emissaries in Iraq prior to the foundation of Israel and Palestine, they were talking about the human material that was there. And they were saying this human material is stronger than the human material in Eastern Europe because of the relative prosperity that Jewish people enjoyed in Iraq in comparison to Eastern Europe, where the persecution is well known. Now, following the establishment of Israel, Tawfiq al-Suwaidi is the prime minister, and he implements this denaturalization law, which basically sets forth that Iraqi Jews can leave and become Israeli, but their property is nationalized by the Iraqi state. Now, in the first month, Abbas Shiblaq has a great book about it called The Law of Zion, and it traces in the first month of the denaturalization law how many Iraqis took up this offer.
Not
and
many, right?
Absolutely infinitesimal number of people. What then happens is Mossad launches a campaign to place bombs at places of Jewish interest. This happened after that in Egypt, also with the Lavon affair, but synagogues, cafes, and that eventually led to the movement of many people. And there's a great documentary on it called Insa Baghdad, Forget Baghdad, where some of these people that were of that generation are talking about their memories and what they went through. And they said, in some cases, we were literally put on the plane and put in camps and sprayed with DDT and left in camps. And we had to protest in order to get housing at all.
Once they'd emigrated.
Once they'd become Israeli. So there was that stratification of the Zionist project ultimately. Now, if you look at the birth rates of Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians in Gaza, you're looking at around 4.5 in Gaza to 3.6 per woman generally. In the West Bank, it's lower, but then if you compare it to Israel now, amongst the Jewish population, it's around 3.09 now. So it's starting to become close. But ultimately, for the longest time, for decades and decades, the birth rate has been higher for the Palestinians by a long stretch. And when you listen to, in the Epstein files, there's a conversation between Epstein and Ehud Barak, and they're saying Israel is doomed. Because for the Zionist project, it's contingent on establishing a majority. And that's also what part of these wars are about, which is culling the population. But also the other problem with Zionism is it's so maximalist that now is seeking to subsume Lebanon, to subsume parts of Lebanon, to subsume parts of Syria, but it doesn't have the human beings to fill it. And that's why Ehud Barak, within that conversation with Epstein, is saying, I'm trying to convince the Russians to let us organize a mass conversion of 1 million Russians to Judaism. So in that sense, Zionism is a doomed project, but the violence that is required to sustain it is so massive that it's easy for us to get lost in the spectacle of that violence and the real human suffering that is there. And I would say sometimes lose sight of the macro picture, which this war now has established that a state which has been subject to the most comprehensive sanctions, it's the second most sanctioned state in the history of the world, has been able to build a program in 27 to 30 missile cities under the ground, which in many cases are under 300 to 600 meters of granite, which cannot be penetrated by bunker buster bombs, and create a system whereby they are able to strike targets thousands of miles away with incredible precision, which is an indigenous project. So there is no involvement of US technology for sure. They rely on GLONASS and BeiDou, which are Chinese and Russian equivalent to GPS and satellite systems. But largely it has been based on the ingenuity of their population, has been able to, and which is institutionally pro-Palestine. And I think that's something that people have, it's definitely been censored by omission. So everybody supports the UN resolution which asserts that the Palestinians have the right to armed resistance as an occupied people. But there is only one state historically which has materially supported that, and that is Iran. There were states previously that supported it in different ways, but none in the institutional and systematized way which Iran was able to do. If you look at the pronouncements of key figures within the resistance factions, you look at Talal Naji of the Jabha Sha'biya Li-Tahrir Palestine, the PFLP, he states absolutely explicitly the Palestinian struggle would not have been able to achieve what it has without that support. You look at the testimony of Saleh al-Aruri, a late leader of Hamas. He stated Iran is the only state in the world that has a budget for the liberation of Palestine. You look at Ziad Nakhala, the head of Jihad al-Islami. He says that Iran gave billions to the Palestinian resistance factions over these decades. And if you take it back even further and look at the development of the forces at work here and the forces at work in Palestine, they say about the Palestinian revolution that it went from al-hajar wal-maqla', so the stone and the slingshot. And that's largely true. You look at the first intifada, it's largely non-violent. And then in the second intifada, you have more desperate measures being taken by the Palestinians. But then the introduction of rockets to the Palestinian resistance factions largely happened through the involvement of the Iranians. And they went to painstaking lengths to do that, only at cost. So,
Why?
for example, well, if you look at the very makeup of how it developed, you see prior to the Islamic Revolution in Iran, those who were working with Khomeini trained in Lebanon with Khalil Wazir, who Abu Jihad, the head of intelligence for Fatah, one of the founders of Fatah. So they already had this relationship. And then you look at the foundation of how many states in the world have a security service which is literally called the Quds Force. It's important that people understand this is an institutional orientation towards fighting Israel.
But why? Where is it coming from? Because I think obviously you and I, like, there's a language that's spoken in this conversation that for example, Al-Quds for
Yeah.
people who are outside of the Muslim
Jerusalem.
community, right, don't
Yeah.
necessarily understand what is being said here. So if I were to interpret that for people
Yeah.
maybe outside of the community,
Yeah.
we are saying that they have a force that's named after Jerusalem and
Yeah.
specifically after a site that is considered, it's often touted as the third holiest site in Islam, but it's
Yeah.
also the beginning of the Hajj traditionally.
The first Qibla.
The first Qibla of Islam, the first orientation for prayer.
Ultimately, that decision was based on a recognition that ultimately, if in that region you are trying to establish independence rather than dependence, you will be visited by the United States and the Israelis. But also, prior to the Islamic Revolution in Iran, you had something called Project Flower, which the Shah initiated with the Israelis. And the experience of Project Flower seems to have deeply scarred many in Iran psychologically, because what it ended up with was Israel basically stealing what they would now call the intellectual property of the Iranians and fulfilling none of their obligations under it. There was similar kinds of deals with the British. Iran paid them for the delivery of a huge amount of tanks that the British never gave them. So the understanding, among those original figures that developed this in the 80s, the war with Iraq really put Iran in a position where Iraq was backed by the Gulf states, it was backed by the United States, less explicitly, but still backed by them and backed largely by Germany. And so there was a disparity in terms of the military capabilities. So Iraq was able to strike cities within Iran, and Iran for years was only able to shoot flares back. In terms of ground forces, Iran had more people, but it did not have, there was no parity in terms of military capability. And so you have Hassan Tehrani al-Muqaddam, one of the key figures in the beginning of the establishing of what they called the Hadid Missile Brigade, and Amir Ali Hajzada. These individuals used their wherewithal and their expertise to reverse engineer some of the rockets that they were able to get through the Libyans at that time, because the only
It's under Gaddafi. Who then
under
gets taken
Gaddafi,
over.
and the only Arab states at that time that fell on the Iranian side of the equation was the Syrians and the Libyans. I'm not sure about the Algerians and the Sudanese, but they were able to reverse engineer things they were getting from the Libyans, which were originally Russian. And so they're enriching their understanding of how we can fight back and target further than the front line of this war. And that process continues. And as I say, these missile cities were established with the ultimate understanding that the destination of what they were building was going to be US bases in the region and Israel. And it's also a difference in mentality. And that mentality has also been seen here in this country. Meaning a defeatist mentality will look at a situation and say, okay, we're in a region full of US military bases. There's nothing we can do. Why don't we have US military bases in our country? A mentality which is based on a faith in victory will say, we're in a region full of US military bases. This is a target-rich environment. And that's the difference. Rather than seeing things as manifestations of power, you see them as vulnerabilities that are being exposed. And the same thing played out in this country. So where we have a society in which the Israel lobby has such power, it's able to bring down politicians who are high-ranking within the government, whether it's Alan Duncan or whether it's Jeremy Corbyn. I'm not saying Israel do it alone. They do it in tandem sometimes with the British establishment or with the US. But what you also have is a level of military integration between Israel. And this war has actually set back that process in the region, and I'll explain why. But first, I just want to say this country, we look at the situation, we say, okay, there's 10 sites for Israel's largest arms company here that we know of. One mentality, which I would say is the default mentality among the mainstream movement, is international law, NGOs, ultimately leading us to Oslo. we're in a dominated society. The other mentality says we're in a target-rich environment. Rather than manifestations of power, these are the equivalent of pressure points in a human body. And if you look at a person's body and you have an understanding of where the pressure points are, you know that with a small amount of consistent pressure to that pressure point, it will affect the rest of the body.
Well, let's talk about that, because Palestine Action, of course, have been doing exactly that, right? The targeting of certain factories that are run by Elbit Systems has been presumably part of exactly the tactic you're talking about, which is putting pressure on these points. And arguably, you could say they had some wins, right? Had there been some contracts that have been cancelled? But also, we've seen a huge amount of repression against the people involved. And I was hoping you might be able to give us a little update on what's happening with the Filton 24, because I think there was a number of things that might have been perceived as quote unquote wins for the group, namely the ruling that the proscription was unlawful, which many thought would lead to a kind of automatic deprescription. The police initially announced that they were no longer going to arrest people. Now they've reversed that and have restarted arresting people. We've seen some members who've now been re-imprisoned, I think just a month after being released. Can you give us an update on the situation of the Filton 24 in particular? And in that regard, would you say that these are the pressure points that are essentially one of the main routes through which people in this country can vocalize their objections to the government's ongoing support for the genocide?
So what neoliberalism did, and this is a very fascinating part of the story, neoliberalism is the economic philosophy that corporations are better suited to carry out the functions of the state than the state itself. So it placed a lot of power in the corporate sector away from the government, and it decentralized a lot of things. So in essence, we know it weakened government, and Grenfell is a perfect example. The government deregulated the construction industry, and that then led to construction companies basically regulating themselves, and they placed flammable insulation and cladding across the country. Okay. Other examples of deregulation and neoliberalism is when what were formerly functions of the state, which is handling of data, then becomes outsourced to who in many cases? Well, the way neoliberalism has been used by Israel, and particularly Unit 8200. So Unit 8200 is Israel's military intelligence unit, which assesses the telecommunications of Palestinians. So that massively increased after Oslo, because before Oslo, a tiny percentage of the Palestinian population were actually connected to landlines. So post-Oslo, Unit 8200 becomes this prestigious unit within the Israeli military, which then gives birth to a plethora of private companies. So it's out of Unit 8200 that you get the NSO group, which gave us this Pegasus spyware. You get Black Cube, which was used by Harvey Weinstein to spy on others. You get a huge amount of companies. One such company was Celebrite. Another such company was Nice Systems. Nice Systems is involved in police investigations in this country. So neoliberalism takes what the state normally provides and outsources it to, in some cases, foreign companies. So Israeli companies that have been founded by individuals from Unit 8200 now carry out key functions of the British state. So what is the understanding when you have arms companies, for example, that are involved in violations of international humanitarian law? When Britain is a signatory to the Arms Trade Treaty, which says that it should not make exports which could be used for violations of international humanitarian law. The weakest point in what Israel's doing in this country is the arms, because when that comes up into a court of law, it's a very difficult argument for them to beat off. And so in the case of some of the things that you're talking about, you have the successful closure of 4 sites for Israel's largest arms company Elbit system took place in this country. It happened nowhere else in the Western world. There was one closed in the United States successfully, but nowhere else has that happened. So people need to actually study how that happened, how these, and the initial phase was young people. What you've alluded to is the, I'd say, third and fourth stage, which has been the involvement of older generations. But the first phase was young people, people who were left out of the professionalization of the Palestinian cause, which came from Oslo, and the NGOization of what were political movements. You've got to remember that this is a site of victory here. It hasn't happened anywhere else what happened. And in an interesting way, the repression that has been faced has had the opposite effect. It's had natija aksiya, they call it. It's had a boomerang effect in which those interested in being involved in this kind of stuff has increased massively and become widespread within the society. And in fact, the legal definition has enforced a popular definition, which is the opposite of the legal definition. So the legal definition has said, this is white. The popular definition has said, this is black, because of the legal definition. So it's a very fascinating case study that I think people need to write PhDs about what has happened here.
What's the biggest lesson we could take from it?
Oh, I mean, the biggest lesson is that Bob Crow of the RMT said it. He said, if you don't fight, you will definitely lose. But if you fight, you might win. And, Samih al-Qasim, for example, he said, الذي لا يقاوم هو أقرب للموت. And for me, that is my philosophy in life. Who doesn't resist is closer to death. And just one small point. Of the 23 of the Filton 24 who have been, and it's clear, juries did not convict them on any of the charges. They are being retrialed on some of the charges. They were acquitted on the most egregious charge. There's one remaining in jail. One has been arrested for the allegation of violating bail conditions for stating on social media take direct action. So they haven't been re-imprisoned, but one has been re-arrested. And so that case is going to come up soon. But it's also worth taking into account that these young people were being processed through the court system. They were managed by a company that had a partnership with Elbit Systems. Their phones were analyzed by the British police using Celebrite, which is an Israeli intelligence company. In some cases, I'm sure that investigations into them were assisted by NICE Systems, which is an offshoot of Unit 8200. So when they were going to and from court for the Filton 24 case, they were receiving one meal a day because the company that was involved in transporting them to and from the court had such a disdain for them. And it's only after the trial that we begin to see that that company actually has a partnership with Elbit Systems on an army contract, which the British government deprived them of in the midst of the hunger strike. During that time, a freedom of information request was finally responded to by the British government in the midst of the hunger strike, which was for the release of information about export licenses granted to Elbit Systems from this country over the last decade. And what did those export licenses reveal? They revealed that Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey were purchasing at least components from an Israeli arms company through Britain. In the midst of the genocide in Gaza, particularly Turkey did. The rest of them didn't. But the rest of them, over the last 10 years, have bought Israeli arms. This is prior to the Abraham Accords in many cases. So what has been revealed is that ultimately you only achieve meaningful political changes and cultural changes when you bypass the levers of government. The way power has been arranged in this country is such that there is a built-in intransigence and lack of accountability. And Grenfell is the perfect example. You have had no situation in my lifetime, certainly, where there has been so much culpability in so many places, which is now publicly acknowledged fact, and so little response within the political establishment. That makes it clear that you have an inflexible political system. And the direct action movement has shown that within neoliberalism, there is a weakening of government as such that if you go directly to the source, which is the corporations themselves, then you can define the parameters of their logic. You can move them around in ways that you want. And, that has been achieved.
Just for people who may not know what Grenfell refers to, 72 people killed in one of the worst fires in London's history. And to this day, no one has gone to prison over that.
Yeah.
And in fact, I don't know how many people have actually been rehoused in the local area.
Well, I make the argument that there was a de facto amnesty of the corporations and criminalization of the community, because a large number of people who lived in the tower have been convicted and jailed post-fire for what are essentially, at worst, crimes of poverty. So this talk of what they called the slogan that they set up of Grenfell fraudsters, this was weaponized massively. And that will all come out in time. But people were imprisoned, for instance, we may have spoken about it. I think you interviewed me around 10 years ago. Underneath Grenfell, around Grenfell. And there was a gentleman by the name of Omega who lived in a block next to Grenfell. Now, Mohammed al-Hajj Ali, who was a Syrian refugee, fell from the 15th floor during the fire. Now, there were riot police on the street while it was happening. I was there, I saw it, I had the cladding in my hair. Mohammed al-Hajj Ali was taken and placed in a block on the floor outside Omega's front door. And he comes out of his front door and sees this body. This is around 5 a.m. He takes a video of it and puts it online. Okay? He's then contacted by a journalist who says, I'd like to meet you to talk about your video. The journalist sets him up to be arrested. He goes to jail for 3 months. For me, that encapsulates the whole story. People are criminalized for what they witnessed, for what they were close to, for what they went through, whereas the companies themselves have made record profits since then. And just the way that a lot of this entwines with what we're talking about is, the key company involved, responsible for the polyethylene cladding on the building was Arconic. Now, Arconic is also involved in the building of the F-35 fighter jets, which bomb Gaza. And that's why today you have the most beautiful piece of artwork on the Wall of Truth around Grenfell is a painting of a child from Grenfell holding hands with a Palestinian in Gaza, and Grenfell to Gaza across the top of a Palestinian flag. And so that, to me, is where the interesting part of culture is those bonds. It's not, the kind of people in boardrooms that make big decisions about other people's lives that they never meet. And the sort of invisible violence that happens with the signature on a piece of paper, for me, is that shared humanity among those who are victims of this status quo.
Well, on that note, do you still believe in the possibility of institutional change? Because obviously back in 2017, you were one of the most vocal supporters of Jeremy Corbyn at the time. Fast forward today, of course, we saw, the debacle around Your Party staff today. Many people are looking at the Green Party as a source of hope. Where do you stand on that?
So let me put it this way. Harold Wilson was the Prime Minister of this country. While he was in power, there was a protest against the Vietnam War by the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. On that protest, one window of the US Embassy was broken. And what was established off the back of it was the Special Demonstration Squad, which at that time, in the late 60s, was given £500,000 initially. It answered directly to MI5. They sent out the spy cops who infiltrated over 1,000 political organizations in this country. We are talking from the National Union of Students, National Union of Teachers, we're talking Houseman's Bookshop, we're talking Organization for Rescuing Hedgehogs, we're talking Vegan Eat Out Wales organization. All of them were infiltrated by spy cops from the Special Demonstration Squad. Simultaneous to that happening, Harold Wilson was being conspired against by his own intelligence service. So you have something called Operation Clockwork Orange, which was revealed by Colin Wallace, who was from British military intelligence in Ireland, the north of Ireland. Now, Operation Clockwork Orange was MI5 collecting compromat on the Prime Minister at the time, and they made him aware of it. You also have the Spy Catcher book by Peter Wright, which details the way in which the intelligence services in this country were seeking to bring down Harold Wilson. Harold Wilson gave Diego Garcia to the US government. He did everything the US government could ask of him. Yes, he didn't send British troops to Vietnam, but he did so much for them. They literally set up an entire spy corps unit off the back of one window being broken in the US.
Isn't that the special
embassy.
relationship, Kareem?
Well, there you go. And so my point is that if you even had someone of the ilk of Harold Wilson be conspired against internally, and Ramsay MacDonald was the same thing in the 20s. The intelligence services planted a letter which they alleged had been written by the head of the Communist Party in Russia, encouraging people to support Ramsay MacDonald. And that was one aspect of what we know about what was planned. Okay, so now we're in a situation where you have more people in the House of Lords and more people represented by the royal family who have an influence on the political situation than those in Parliament who are elected supposedly by the local population. You will change very small things within the society through Parliament. There's a small window of activity there. However, what you can do is you can enforce the conditions within which they act by building things outside of the political system. And so that's what we've attempted to do. And I would say successfully, because there are decisions that are being made right now and that have been made right now because of the strategy adopted and adapted by those of us who are seeking to enforce that parameter of choice in terms of what is publicly acceptable, in terms of what does and doesn't expose them to some form of legal consequence, what does and doesn't seem acceptable to the liberal sensibilities of the British establishment. But that's a small drop in the ocean in comparison to what we're talking about, because it's the establishment is trying to push the society in a further right and authoritarian direction. And also, Britain has to adapt to a world where not only will the dollar not be the number one currency, particularly with what Iran has achieved recently, but more significantly than that, English probably won't be the lingua franca, but more significantly than that for Britain, the 20 fastest growing economies, none of them are in Europe. Many of them are former British colonies. So how is a state that has the history that Britain has going to adapt to that world where people will be able to turn around and get reparations? That will happen. And so I think it's going to be a very difficult process for people here to deal with. But also you've got to think about what 2003 represents. So they view the alliance.
Who's they?
Well, Tony Blair recently published an article about it, and we know that he's not speaking, solely for himself, but he certainly is in the Israeli orbit, as of Lord Levy, who they called Lord Cashpoint, essentially recruiting him while he was a Labour politician to become the leader. And he was pumped full of support by the Israel lobby. And since then, Tony Blair has acted, he's on the board of the JNF, for example. He's acted for the Israelis in a major way, and his new handler seems to be Larry Ellison, who's extremely close to Benjamin Netanyahu. So when Tony Blair says we need to, what they call the red and green alliance, so the supposed alliance between leftists and what they call Islamists, we need to combat that alliance and break that alliance. If they look at the mobilization of people in 2003 against the Iraq War, you have, by some estimates, 3 million people on the street. Okay, that is almost 5% of the population. At that time, and now it would be less, obviously. That is a dangerous voting bloc. In order for them to achieve what they want to achieve, they have to try and find a way to scatter that movement of people. If all of those kind of people start voting in the same way, there's problems.
I do want to ask you 3 last questions. The first question is to do with people power. And I think, it's been obviously a theme running through our discussion today. And I know you're a big believer in people power. You're always, many times I meet you, that is where we find you, which is with the people. How do you square that with, for example, what's happening with Iran right now? Like, obviously, there is an internal movement within Iran as well that opposes the government. How do you kind of square that tension, which is that there are many people within that country, particularly young people, who are just like really sick of the current political system that they're living through? How do you square that?
In all societies, there's people with political grievances. Now, the question is on the political system, to what extent it can assimilate those grievances into the system. And in a way, what we've been talking about is whether this society and the political system that rules it can assimilate the type of grievances that someone like me has. But what you have in the Iranian context is the existence of those grievances, which also, let's be clear, when the level of economic warfare has been carried out against Iran, Rudolph Giuliani, for example, who's a big supporter of these sanctions, said literally you have people selling organs in Iran because of the sanctions. And he said, this is the direction we need things to go. So it's been actively targeted in that way by the most aggressive economic measures. But what you have also had, and this is, simply the case, Mike Pompeo has gone on record and said very clearly, the Mossad are on the streets next to you side by side. You have Donald Trump going on record saying we sent weapons to the Iranians. You have Mossad itself in Farsi tweeting,
without a
we
doubt,
have people on the street. So therefore, from my perspective, as somebody in this country who is focused on the Palestinian cause, I can only express my gratitude for what has been done in terms of the Palestinian cause. In terms of understanding the ins and outs of what is actually happening in Iran, I think it's important people know Farsi, and I don't know Farsi. So in order to understand the intricacies of what's happening there. But however, I do think there has been a greater ability of the political system there to assimilate those criticisms and actually adapt to those criticisms, particularly if you look at the situation from the early 2020s, 2022. I think culturally, ground was ceded to some of those movements, but I think politically and militarily, the orientation of independence against the United States and Israel remained strong, and the world has been changed. The entire world has been changed.
I mean, there's no doubt that, if you study history, the colonizers have always used, the imperialists have always used local fermenting of dissent as an internal tool to break apart. In fact, even the last Islamic empire was brought down arguably through these strategies. So that's for sure. I just think it'd be interesting to revisit this conversation maybe after the war is over, and where those grievances remain among young people, particularly around issues of corruption, I think is the big one that a lot of people point to.
But my point is that our perception of those criticisms and those issues, which always increase under sanctions. So every single society, you can literally trace the word you just used, in comparison to where the sanctions are. That
Yeah, Cuba is the
because
same.
things have to exist in such a way that people are taking ultimately shortcuts to make the society work. Now, in what I would say is that our perception of those issues is certainly not proportional. I think because our media is structured in such a way, there is such a focus, a hyper focus on these grievances within the society, which are also weaponized in such a way as to say, rather than those issues being dealt with by the political system and somehow ameliorated, it becomes do away with the whole system. Now that's quite a move. That is quite a move, which I think in my position is certainly not one that I would ever be in a position to take with a government that is currently fighting Israel in the United States.
Oh, and I guess ultimately, which is the point, is for the Iranian people themselves to decide
Absolutely.
first and foremost, right?
Absolutely.
I think maybe there's a flattening. Sometimes it's the same conversation I would have with Palestinian friends of mine who have lived under Hamas. They would never perhaps vocalize certain criticisms during moments of resistance, but that doesn't mean that grievances around certain issues on the ground don't also exist, right? The two can coexist simultaneously. How governance is operated and how people experience that, and the necessity of protection of the people in the land.
I think it also depends on what you perceive as representative of majority opinion, and
Well, these are not open societies where we can easily get a.
Well, are they or are they not? I think that's it.
You can't do polls, right? You can't do a huge poll. There've been polls in Gaza, and then obviously they're always disputed in terms of like, is there a majority support? Is there no majority support?
But do you think we're positioned in a way and in a place and in a comprehension place to fully understand that? Would you say that?
Well, I'm not going to try, but I definitely am in touch with people who have lived under those systems but that's
their perspective.
Of course. And what I'm saying is, I think that sometimes in the resistance movement, there's an erasure of legitimate criticisms of the way systems operate. And I understand the instrumentalization of those, particularly in moments of warfare, to try and bring them down. My concern is with their erasure.
What I would say is, in order for organizations to exist under the gun of the most technologically advanced empire with military prowess never seen before, with a larger budget than any military in the world. I mean, if you look at the Iranian example, it's almost 100 times the US budget, military budget is almost 100 times that of Iran. In order to function under the gun of this empire, there has to be a certain level of popular legitimacy for it to continue to survive. That's not to say that there aren't people with grievances, and there's not to say that there aren't situations where people have causes that should be responded to. The question is whether the mechanisms exist for them to be responded to, or whether there is an outright opposition ideologically. Do you understand? So I, on the Grenfell issue, for example, have an ideological opposition to the idea of the royal family. It's deeply held. I have, I would say, convictions about that subject. Is that reflective of the majority of this population? Probably not. Would it prevent something like Grenfell from being dealt with within the framework of British liberalism? Surely it could have been dealt with within that framework. Would it being dealt with necessitate the overthrowing of that entire system? And then with that system, it's what they call in fawdawiyya in Arabic. Fawdawiyya, it has its basis in the word fawda, which is chaos. So am I inviting, especially when I am in complete cognizance of the fact that on the Israeli side, not on the US side, the US side favor more regime change. The Israeli side favor something called clean break, which was written up by the neocons, by Richard Pearl and others, for Netanyahu. And it was a way to deal with the question of Syria. This was around the time of the Iraq invasion. And what it basically put forth was you split up the society in ethnic and sectarian ways, and you arm different groups within the society. You decentralize political and military power, and you break down central military force. Now, in the case of Iran, the objective for the Israelis is the situation of al-Ahwaz, but actually you've seen al-Ahwaz hugely supportive of the war effort against Iran. The situation of the Kurds, they would want to arm them, and they seemingly have not responded to the invitation of the Americans and the Israelis to do that.
Apparently they took the arms and ran.
And then you've got Baluchistan, which also brings Pakistan into the question. So these kind of fault lines of that state, how can you break it apart? How can you decentralize political and military power? And then how can you allow us to continue what we're doing and pour the rest of the region into the chaos? So I think it's a question of macro and micro and where those things meet ultimately.
Final question to you.
Yeah.
So we obviously are talking in London right now on the subject of music, which we began the interview with.
Yeah.
There's been big news. The Wireless Festival has been cancelled.
Yeah.
Wireless, for those who aren't familiar, would obviously be one of the biggest festivals in London.
Yeah.
And it was cancelled because it was supposed to headline Kanye. Kanye
Yeah.
was then banned from entering the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And now the whole festival's been shut down. Firstly, were they right to invite Kanye? And secondly, do you think that the increasing repression against the spaces
Yeah.
where culture gets to maybe push the boundaries a little bit more
Yeah.
could be part of a sort of groundswell shift that perhaps is needed in this moment?
So the Israel lobby is consistently top heavy. And that plays out in the decapitation assassination program. So the idea was that if you kill Abu Ali al-Mustafa, the PFLP will cease to be a factor. Within months, the PFLP carried out the largest, highest level assassination of an Israeli political figure, which was the Israeli Minister of Tourism at that time. The idea was you kill Abbas al-Musawi, Hezbollah will cease to exist. They defeated Israel twice after that, and a third time, if you count what's happening now, how that will pan out. All of the founders of Hamas were killed. Even if you take it back to Izzuddin al-Qassam, when they killed him in the 30s, the idea was you will quell this idea of Palestinian nationalism. What you then had was the longest strike in recorded human history carried out by the Palestinians in 1936. And now you have them fighting people who name themselves after Izzuddin al-Qassam, right? So this top-heavy decapitation, the only place where it kind of worked is with Fatah, kind of, but not totally, partially. So in this case, what they've done is decided that somebody clearly suffering from a mental illness, he's clearly got serious, it will be diagnosed.
He's spoken about medication
drugs,
before.
Yeah, there's medication, there's all types of issues there, who has been indulged for a long time. Me personally, I mean, I don't view what he says as coherent and intelligible generally nowadays. I think he made incredible music many, many years ago, and still some, from the little superficial knowledge that I have of it in the recent years, some decent music. But what this will do, ultimately, is turn a lot of people to a place where they say, well, there's clearly a hierarchy of political subjectivity, number one, in the country, because there's some people who are able to have more of an influence on the political system, seemingly by virtue of identity. And there's a hierarchy of what is understood to be racism. But then it's also a hierarchy of politicized racism. Because if you look at somebody like Jimmy Carr, for example, he can make jokes about the Holocaust, but because he goes to events celebrating the foundation of Israel, he's impervious to this type of lobbying. At no point will Jimmy Carr be given a hard time about jokes about the Holocaust, because it's the way in which this has become integrated a lot of this stuff. And so I think that in a cultural way, it's not going to be received well by people, because ultimately Kanye West, for some people, represents a nostalgia. And I think that people go to shows to enjoy that and to perform themselves. That's what I've noticed about performing live, is people actually come to sing the songs of the artist, not just see that person. I think ultimately it will backfire as a decision for everyone involved, really.
It's interesting because it reminds me of, do you remember that Epstein file that dropped that talked about Jay-Z being referred to, and the kind of steam valve that's provided by certain events? And I think about that in the context of our capital, which, I know there's a lot of propaganda about our capital that goes out to the world, but actually very little of it is to do with Sadiq Khan and the alleged violence on our streets. It's to do with frustrations, socioeconomic frustrations, and a lack of political voice for many people. And I think of wireless as one of those valves.
Interesting.
I do. And I think about it in terms of who goes to wireless as well. And I think about where wireless is held. And I think about you've removed that valve, and you've removed that valve at this time with everything that's going on right now. So we'll see whether the summer of discontent will unravel. Kareem, thank you so much for coming on the show. Appreciate you. Thank you so much for watching today's episode of The Tea. If this conversation sparked something for you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Follow us here on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. And if you want to support our show and independent journalism, you need to join us over on Patreon. You'll get bonus content, ad-free episodes, and a voice in what we cover next. The links are in our bio. In the meantime, stay questioning, stay awake, and we'll be back soon with more tea. Thanks for tuning into The Tea. If this conversation resonated with you, let us know in the comments below. We love to hear from you. And remember to share our content with someone you think should hear it. And why not listen to these other episodes we think you'll love? Let's keep the conversation flowing.